My name is Matthew F. Stevens, and this is EQ Unlocked. In this episode, I want to correct something important. For a long time, emotional intelligence has been taught as awareness, regulation, and choices. Looking back on my own life and the lives of those I loved, I realized this order doesn't really work in real life. Regulation has to come first. Until the nervous system learns how to recover, awareness doesn't lead to better choices, it leads to frustration. So today, we're shifting the order. Regulation, awareness, choices. So awareness alone doesn't create change. Many people like me, we understand ourselves, but we still repeat the same behaviors. The missing piece, what I've come to realize, is that the missing piece was regulation. Unfortunately, insight without regulation doesn't produce growth. At least for me, it produced frustration. And so if you're like me and you understand that all the right things to do, but you find it hard to do them, regulation may be your problem. And at least that was the case with me. And so, you know, I, I look back at my life and I ask myself, I know all these things. I have all this knowledge. Then why is it failing? And what I realized is that the more I knew, the more I would be critical and judge myself. The more I knew, it it, it created, more rumination, more I should have known better. I should do better. Knowing why, it didn't stop my reactions because my system was constantly overloaded. And so really awareness at the end of the day is more about information. It's not about control. And, regulation for me anyway is not about control. It's about getting back to a baseline quicker. You know, regulation lowers baseline stress. And I want to give you a few examples of that in real life, just from just rather recently. When we're at our baseline and we're regulated, we have access to a different level of thinking. I'm sure you've experienced this even if you don't realize it. Have you ever been in a car accident? Or mm, have you ever been pulled over by the police? Or have you ever just been triggered by something, even if you couldn't put your finger on in that moment what it was? And then for the next however long, you just kept thinking about that thing. And so your choices after that were not what you normally would have, the choices you normally would have made. Well, that's because you weren't regulated. And so regulation, you know, it has it has its place in different areas of life and different times in life. At different we have different states of regulation. I've said this before. I believe that my father always used to tell me, "Hey man, why don't you sit down and relax?" And I'm like, "I can't relax, man. I got to go faster." I felt like what's that guy's name? Ricky Bobby. you know, I just felt like I had to speed up all the time. Like that's all there was to it. But what I didn't realize is that there was no regulation as far as my existence goes. I had to keep running because if I didn't keep running, well, that wasn't safe. I had to keep moving. I had to keep doing something. I had to keep accomplishing because if I didn't, well, that would be unsafe. So as I looked into this and I really dug into myself and the people around me and the people I loved, and I started looking back at people, kids I've worked with, people I've worked with, I realized that regulation was the prerequisite for any type of growth. Someone had to be regulated first. And the more they wanted to grow, the lower that baseline had to become. And so let me make it clear, regulation is not about suppression. It's not about saying, oh, I don't feel this thing. I don't feel these things at all. Regulation is actually about the recovery speed. How fast do you bounce back when something hits you? If you're, I've said this forever. I said this when I worked in jails. I said this, I was recently having a conversation with a retired commander in a Virginia State prison, from a Virginia State prison, excuse me. I explained to him that if our nervous system, if we don't feel safe, our nervous system won't allow change to take place, right? Because it's always going to revert back to those fight or flight moments. It's always going to revert back to those moments where stress was high. And so we have to learn how to regulate. And that can be challenging, but it doesn't have to be. So I'm going to share a quick personal story with you guys. And not like that's anything new, but I just want to share it with you. So earlier this week, I was out on the golf course and it was a beautiful day. I'm about to tee off. I'm on hole one. I'm gearing up for a great day. You know what I'm saying? Like it's just going to be amazing. And I know it. I can just feel it. And my daughter calls me and I answer the phone. I'm like, "Hey kid, what's up?" And she's excited. She's happy. And I'm like, "Hey, what's going on?" I'm excited for her. And so she starts to tell me, she was like, "Dad, I didn't tell you." She was like, "But," because I didn't know if it was going to happen or not. So I didn't want to, I just want to keep it to myself till it came out. She said, "I got my temps." And I was like, "Yeah, good job." Like, I'm. Proud of her. And then just as quickly as I was happy for her, an angst set in my chest. And what do I mean by angst? I was bothered. I was upset. I was hurt. Now, the selfish side of me knows that I should have just been excited for her and there should have been nothing else to it but being excited for her, right? I shouldn't have made it about me at all. The rational side of my brain knows that. But the emotional side of me felt the loss. The emotional side of me felt the manipulation, the abuse of how she ended up with her mom. And so the injustice of how that took place, right? And so that took over for a minute. And I quickly, I told her congratulations, I'm proud of her. And I said, "Hey kid," because she knew I was about to go. She knew it was my turn. I was about to tee off, and I said, explained to her, I said, "Hey kid, I'm about to tee off, but I gotta jump off of here, and I'll talk to you later." And so as I stood up there and I lined my club up and teed up my ball, knew something was off inside me. I knew that I was frustrated by this moment, that I wanted to be there to hug my daughter and to support her and tell her, "Hey, great job, congratulations." And it couldn't be. And and I was hurt. And so I took the club back, swung it, nice follow through, boom. The ball didn't even leave the ground. It went about 100 yards, smacked the side of a wall, and ended up in the rough somewhere. And I knew exactly as soon as that ball hit that wall, it was like a metaphor for me. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, what are you doing, Matthew? What are you doing?" And so I jump in my little go-go kart, make it over to my ball and take another shot. That shot's not as bad, but it's still pretty rough. And I'm like, "Take a deep breath, relax. This is Journey's moment. And you need to be happy for Journey. You need to push it, whatever feelings you're feeling right now, off to the side, because right now it's time for you to be happy for Journey." And so the person I was going with took the cart on up, and I walked to where my ball was at, which is still probably only another 100 yards away. And I smacked it again and I landed on the green. And when got, I continued walking and I saw the person I was golfing with, and I said, "Hey man," I said, was my daughter on the phone. She told me she just got her son. She was like, "Hey man, congratulations. That's great." And just like that, I became, regulated myself on that short 200-yard walk, right? I then shared that good news because I knew it was good news with somebody who I knew would be just as happy as I was, or as happy as I wanted to be about what had happened for her. And I continued playing my day, and I probably had one of the best rounds of golf that I've ever had. And so, you know, I tell that story to show how a lack of regulation can really mess us up. Now, granted, I was just golfing, right? At the end of the day, that doesn't really matter to me all that much. I mean, yes, I enjoy it. Yes, I like to do well, but it's not going to make or break me, you know? But what happened is that I grew and I regulated and I bounced back. In less than probably 7 minutes, I went from something that would have spent me into a whirlwind of chaos 7 months ago to being happy, genuinely happy for the person I love. And so then I started translating that, right? I started really digging into that because that's how my mind works. And so I started really getting into what does awareness after regulation do versus what does it do beforehand? And so the reality is awareness becomes accurate only after our nervous system is calm. Before then, it can turn into hypervigilance. It can turn into spiraling. It can turn into anxious thought. It can turn into all these things before regulation, but after regulation, then we can take in and appreciate the moment for what it's worth. But we have to be calm first. When I told him that my daughter got her temps and he celebrated and he was happy with me, I realized in that moment that I didn't need to tell the backstory. I didn't need to tell the story about how everything ended up, how we got to this point. I didn't need to share that. I could simply be happy for her. And so, but that could only come after regulation, right? I realized that I saw a pattern and it was clear rather than overwhelming. And the best part of it is, the absolute best part of it is that I could genuinely be happy with and for my daughter. And so awareness worked because regulation made space for it, right? That's why awareness worked. And so then I started getting into all the things that I talk about, and I started thinking about all the things that have, many of the things that have taken place in my life, and the people who I've dealt with, and how I always encourage them to be regulated first, and then become aware, and then make better choices. But I had not always done that with myself. And so I learned and I grew. And so I started looking back at my life and the moments that meant so much to me. And I started digging in and figuring out what people actually meant when their behavior said one thing and their words said another. And so I started looking at Ashley. And, Ashley told me, and this is one of the things that really helped me to be willing to go to any measures to become the man that I knew I could become, is that she looked at me and she said, I feel safer in your arms than anywhere else in the world. Anywhere I've ever felt, yeah, I feel safer in your arms. And so I thought to myself, I'm like, well, what does that mean? As far as this, in this context that we're talking about, what does this mean? And I guess what that means to me and what it means to me now that I maybe didn't understand even 7 months ago, 6 months ago, is that she felt regulated when she was with me. She knew that she was safe. She knew that I was a safe place for her to be. And my arms were safe for her to be in. And that when she was with me, that the world would come to an end before I would let anybody hurt her. And I think to myself how much regulation that would cause in the nervous system. And now, unfortunately, you know, there were many lessons to be learned after that. But nevertheless, that is the truth of the situation. And then I started expanding a little bit further. And, I worked with a kid many years ago, and we'll just call him Chucky. That's not his name, but that's what we'll call him. And Chucky, when I met him, he was all over the place. Chucky he was crazy, 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 crazy. Not crazy as in like psychotic. Crazy as in the kid was all over the place. I mean, the kid was drinking hand sanitizer. The kid was, you know, talking about wanting to, you know, just do everything and be everyone. He reminded me a lot of myself, actually. You know, he was all over the place. He would run away from the facility and we'd have to go track him down. And that was his normal. That was the normal thing he did. And so at some point, he and I became close. And actually, what the point was is that one night I got a call that my father was in the hospital and that he was dying. And I was working with Chucky that in particular day. And I couldn't leave until Chucky was asleep. And so, or not asleep, but he had to be in his room and be quiet. And so imagine your father in the hospital dying and you can't get to him because a teenager is wanting to cut up and act a fool. And so I dealt with Chucky that night. And I decided that night that never again would I be in that situation. And so I left. I told Chucky. I said, "Hey." The next couple of days, I went in. I sat down and talked to him. I said, "Hey, man, I want to talk to you for a second." And he was like, "Okay, Mr. Stevens, what's going on?" Because he really likes me. Actually, he sent me a video telling me about how much I changed his life, and I really appreciate that. And you know, I showed him. I told him. I said, "Hey, man, my dad was in the hospital the other night, and I couldn't get to him because of the way you were acting." And this serious look came over his face. This look I had never seen. And I explained to him, I said, "Hey, man," I said, "I know that you didn't know that, and I wasn't going to share that with you." I said, "But we need to be more mindful of our choices. We need to be more mindful about how the things we do impact other people." And so that was that. That was that conversation. And at the time, I meditated on a regular basis. And he came to me and he was like, "Hey, Mr. Stevens, can you teach me how to meditate?" I said, "Can I teach you how to meditate?" "Sure, sure, sure, sure. Why not?" And so sporadically, well, it wasn't sporadic because it was every day that I was at work. But inevitably, he would come up to me and he would ask, "Hey, Mr. Stevens, can we meditate?" And we would sit out in the grass and just meditate. So imagine this kid who is running around campus like a madman. He's throwing things, he's running away, he's creating all kinds of chaos. He's just he's just all over the place. He doesn't go to school. When he does go to school, he doesn't try. You have other staff threaten to beat the shit out of him because he's so annoying in their minds, all of a sudden coming up and asking you to meditate. And here was the amazing thing, is that after he learned to meditate, I I shortly thereafter left that job. And he contacted me probably about 6 months after that day. He's like, "Mr. Stevens, I just want to thank you for all that you did for me." He's like, "I want to thank you for teaching me how to meditate and how to just be still." And he told me that he had graduated high school early and that he was holding down a full-time job. That's the power of regulation, my friends. But it didn't stop there. I had another situation. I had another situation. This just happened a few days ago. And there's a young lady. Her name is Drew. And Drew struggles with some major depressive issues, like major depression issues. She, we'll just leave it at that. She struggled with major depression issues. And so for about the last 6, 7 months, I've just been dropping little nuggets. "Hey, maybe you should try this." Or I'd read something in a book and I'd show her, "Hey, I saw this and it reminded me of you." And so about 2 days ago, she sent me a journal entry. And that journal entry said that essentially, and I'm going to cut it very brief, and thank you, Drew, for allowing me to share this. That journal entry basically said, "I love my life," or I've not, "I love my life," I'm sorry. "I want to become a better person. I'm responsible for my choices. I'm responsible for my outcomes. And I now believe that I can build a better life, and I'm going to build a better life for myself." Now, that might not seem phenomenal, but when you go from someone who is holding up signs that talk about all types of negative stuff beforehand, just 3, 4 months ago, to now looking at her life and being appreciative of all these moments and having an outlook for the future that involves hope, well, that's powerful. That's extremely powerful. And so then I asked myself, I said, what was it that created this ability for this massive shift to take place? And so as Drew and I were talking, I pointed out to her that it was regulation, and that what she was describing to me was just being regulated, being able to step back and breathe and know that everything was going to be okay, even when it felt overwhelming in that moment. And this woman's anxiety was bad. It was real bad. She's not there anymore. And for me, that's extremely exciting. And so I created these, what is it called? What's it called? Merch, right? And so I handed out these pins to everyone that said better awareness, better choices, or better awareness, better regulation, better choices. And I started looking at that pin and I was like, oh yeah, that's not right. I have to do something about that. I have to change that. And that's when it occurred to me to make this podcast. And so, you know, I realized that change had to take place before better choices could be made. That regulation had to come into play. As regulation came into play and awareness came into play, better choices were just a natural outcome. Right? Choices are not about willpower. We may think they are, but they're really not. They're about access. And when we're regulated, better options are available automatically. But that's something that you can't learn if you're always in a state of panic. Or that's something that you can't learn if you're living in a state of fear. And, you know, most people don't choose poorly because they want to. They're choosing from a dysregulated state. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people in the world that benefit from you making choices in a dysregulated state. And so, what would life look like if you showed up regulated in your relationships? Would there be less escalation, better communication? What would it look like if you were able to show up to work regulated and remain regulated throughout your entire day? Better decision making, improved performance? Would you show up? Would you not take as many sick days? What if regulation showed up when you were parenting, when you showed up with presence over reaction? And this one hit me in the chest hard the other day. I was talking to Journey and she said, Dad, she said, I went and talked to my therapist today and she asked me a question about you I never thought about. I said, oh yeah. I was like, what is that? And she asked me if I was jealous. And she said, I am jealous. No, I'm never jealous of my dad. And she said, well, and her therapist asked her, well, you're not jealous over his relationship and the relationship he had with your sister? And Journey said, no, no, my dad, no, never. And she said, what about his relationship with such and such and his relationship with such and such? Nope, nope, not at all. And Journey looked at her and she said, my dad is my best friend. And so the therapist then asked her, well, do you guys argue? And Journey said to her, no, never. And the therapist then said, well, you guys didn't agree on everything. And Journey said, no, we don't agree on everything at all. Actually, that's one of the best things about our relationship is that we don't agree on everything at all. We can just respect each other's opinions and respect where the other person is at without needing to implore our will. My daughter is 17 years old and she has that kind of insight. That's a beautiful thing. And the fact that my 17-year-old daughter refers to me as her best friend, that's a privilege beyond compare. And so, but what I realized is that the one thing I always showed up with for Journey was as much regulation as possible. I'm not saying I was perfect. I'm not saying I did it flawlessly by any means. If you hear past the episode, you'll know that. But what was consistent was my regulation when I was dealing with her. I can confidently say that I have only raised my voice at Journey maybe one time her entire life because I knew what it was like to live in fear of a father. And I wanted to make sure that when it came to Journey, that my baseline was her safe place. So what would regulation look like in leadership? I was, what would it look like in leadership? You show up and you're regulated. Well, that means you're going to deal with everybody in an empathetic and an understanding way. You're going to make decisions from clarity. You're going to make decisions that benefit the company. You're going to make decisions that benefit everyone around you, including yourself. You're going to make decisions that are clear, that are concise, that are direct. But you have to be regulated first. And so if you're not regulated or you find yourself becoming dysregulated easy, don't beat yourself up over it. Just know that it's a skill that you have yet to learn. Because at the end of the day, Behavior changes once our baseline changes. After this becomes our new normal, our behaviors change. And that's a very beautiful thing when done the correct way. So here's a simple takeaway. Simple thing you can do. Stop asking what am I feeling first? Because even though your feelings are valid and they're real to you, your feelings shouldn't be driving your behaviors. And at least I couldn't allow, let me rephrase that. I couldn't allow my feelings to drive my behaviors. Because when my feelings drove my behaviors, I inevitably made choices that were selfish. I inevitably made decisions that weren't beneficial for everybody involved. I made decisions that were driven by fear. I made decisions that were driven by fear of abandonment, fear of loss, fear of pain, right? Because when you're regulated, here's the thing that nobody tells you, especially if you're used to living in a state of high anxiety, regulation feels extremely boring. But that's how you know you're in the right place. And so instead of asking, what am I feeling right now? Maybe a better question would be, is my nervous system regulated enough to respond to this? And so emotional intelligence doesn't start with insight. It starts with safety, regulation, awareness, and choices last.
As this episode comes to a close, take a moment to notice what stood out for you. Emotional intelligence isn't about having all the answers. It's about building awareness, understanding yourself and the people around you, and choosing how you respond, especially when things feel difficult. Growth happens through reflection and practice, not pressure or perfection. If this conversation supported you, consider sharing it with someone who may benefit from it as well. To explore more tools and resources around emotional intelligence and personal development, connect with EQ Unlocked and Knowles. Until next time, remember, better awareness leads to better choices, and better choices lead to a better life. This is EQ Unlocked.